And with that bodhicitta motivation, do the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. Let's see, and for those who are following in the text, right, Gachin Yeshi Gyaltsen's A Necklace for those of clear awareness, clearly revealing the modes of minds and mental factors. We're up to page 48. And we're right near, just up coming to the end of the section on the 11 virtuous mental factors. Right. So we've covered those 11, and this is kind of a final concluding section. And of course, I just want to remind everybody that, that the reason why, it's just this obvious in a way, but why are we studying the 11? We're going to study the 11 virtuous mental factors and then the non-virtues, and the purpose is to understand our own mind, right? I'm just reminding all of that, right? And to also remember, actual Dharma practice means, right, cultivating virtuous mental factors and decreasing and eliminating non-virtuous ones, right? You could say there is no other Dharma practice other than that, right? Because the virtuous mental factors are the causes of happiness, and the non-virtuous mental factors are the causes of samsara, right, of suffering. The afflictive emotions are the cause of samsara, along with the karma. But even the karma, right, is created, as we'll see, motivated by the non-virtues. So actually this is, when we're studying this, it's to understand our own mind, our own process of how we suffer and how we find happiness, liberation. It's like a guide to our own practice and way of living. Even if you're not practicing, even if somebody was not practicing Buddhism, right, still, what Buddhism is asserting is understanding these qualities of the mind is how you suffer, or how you find happiness. So actually, from a Buddhist perspective, this is how, it's how the mind works, and it's also how beings find happiness and suffering. So that's why we're studying it, just sort of a reminder. But then this concluding section on virtues, right? We're at the bottom of page 48. And I just want to note that, so here it says, when the virtues are explained above are divided from the viewpoint of circumstances, there is, and then it gives a list of 8 circumstances of virtue. We'll go through them briefly, but one thing I want to note here, just before we go through them, so you can kind of notice it, right, is what it's getting at, and the same things, anyway, let's say with virtue. What it's pointing to, if you look carefully, is that one point is that virtues don't come about randomly, right? What's the Buddhist view? Everything comes about due to causes. There are appropriate causes and conditions, right? So virtues, which are the cause of happiness and well-being, don't just happen. They happen due to causes, right? And we'll see what they are. So the first one, right, the first circumstance is virtue by way of attainment at birth. And he says, is, for instance, the faith that arises through mere rebirth, due to the imprints from past lives without depending upon familiarization in this life. So what's he saying there, right? That sometimes certain people have virtue, will have a virtuous mind arise due to past cultivation in past lives, right? And so we could, that's important, isn't it? Because one point is that's not random, right? It comes about due to effort in a past life. One implication of that, of course, is if you want to make progress on the path, you have to practice and develop those habits in this life so that you'll have them in future lives. Otherwise, you won't, right? Um, and so, if you and just think about that in relation to yourself. Like, so if there's any sometimes may look and go, well, I don't really have virtuous habits or something. That's possible. But then if you look and see that you do have some virtuous habits, right? Like, let's say, for example, if you have some tendency to be loving, right, towards, say, an animal that's sick, or to a person that's injured, harmed or something, right? Well, not everybody has that, right? In other words, you can look and see there are some, if you're actually just looking at people, right? There are some people who, when they see, it's actually true, isn't it? There are some people, when they see an animal injured, they're happy. They try to make it worse, right? That's their karmic tendency. So if your tendency through birth is to have compassion, I'm just giving a simple example, right? You see an animal injured and you have compassion. They're saying here that's due to past lives cultivation of compassion, right? And again, you can, if you think about it, any virtuous, right? Like, some people, like, if you're in this kind of chance, right? Like when you heard something about Buddhism, maybe you had some feeling of faith suddenly arise, right? Other people feel aversion when they hear something about Buddhism, right? They feel like, oh, something like that, right? That's due to karma and past lives, is what they're saying. Everything, and what they're just pointing out is everything, all of our mental habits, all of our mental it's also true with people, right? Like, sometimes you look at one person, right? Like, sometimes you meet one person, you immediately feel some sense of caring about them. Then you may meet somebody else, and without knowing anything about them, you feel some sense of, like, what's the word? Anger or something. So that's past life imprints, right? If it's not a cause of this life, then they say it's a karmic imprint. So what this is saying here about virtue then is, if you have some natural virtue, which actually all of us have to some extent, it's due to having cultivated something positive in past lives. And so what it's saying, and there's an implication there, which is it doesn't come about causelessly, and everything arises due to causes and conditions. Then the next, number 2, virtue by way of application. Again, Kashin Yeshe Gelsen gives an example, is, for instance, the generation of the wish to attain Buddhahood, bodhicitta, and depends upon the four conditions: relying on a virtuous spiritual guide, listening to the excellent doctrine, properly taking such to mind, right? So, like, bringing one's attention again and again to the Dharma, that Dharma teaching one heard from one's virtuous spiritual guide, and then practicing the doctrines that are concordant with the attainment of nirvana, right? So, and why does he list all 4 there, right? He's making a point, right? Which is, one point is, most of our virtue comes through application. It comes through effort. And then he's listing those 4 because it has to come about through the correct effort, right? In other words, and what he's implying there is, for example, he's saying, how do you generate bodhicitta, right? And so there's an implication. You don't generate bodhicitta just by thinking, may I have bodhicitta, right? Or you don't think it by thinking, bodhicitta is great, may all beings, like, if you just had to think the thought, may I achieve enlightenment for all sentient beings, that's not bodhicitta, right? You have to practice what he's describing here, right? So relying on a virtuous spiritual guide, listening to exhortation, and properly take it to mind. That means, like, what, if it's bodhicitta, it would be the 7-point cause and effect method, or the method of equalizing self and others, and you contemplate those and meditate on those over and over until bodhicitta arises. And so it's only through application that most of our virtuous qualities arise, right? Through effort. And so he's saying, this is, that's the right. The ones that arise naturally are due to effort in a past life. But our task is to make application effort in this life by creating all the appropriate causes to give rise to a certain result. I was just remembering, like, a friend of mine told me that one time Rebbe Rinpoche was like, I should just share this brief story, but Rebbe Rinpoche had done, like, when he was young, he was a toku, a geshe, but when he was young, I guess, like, Bonker Rinpoche was his guru, his root guru, and he said, come do the retreat where I'll teach you, like, Rebbe Rinpoche was a scholar, he already had studied, but he did there's a version of retreat where your Lama just teaches you a tiny meditation, and you go off to, like, a hut or a cave, and you just meditate on that until you realize it, and you come back and you express your realization, and then your Lama teaches you the next little tiny part, you go meditate on that, you come back. And so Pabonka Rinpoche said, why don't you do that? Come. Like, so Rebbe Rinpoche did that, retreat like that under Pabonka Rinpoche. Like, so he did this, right? Listen to the Lama, practice each stage of the path until you realize it. And then he famously had done a retreat like that with Pabonka Rinpoche. And then he said to a friend of mine once, he said, why don't you come and do that with me? And he said, you'll very quickly realize renunciation. That'll be easy. And they said it'll take quite a long time to realize bodhicitta. It'll take a lot of effort. But you can realize it after some years of practice like that. But then the friend had some other task and wasn't able to go, which I thought was unfortunate. But the point is like what Rinpoche Rinpoche was saying was you can realize anything. Like, in other words, any Dharma practice can be realized. You just have to do the causes, right? You listen to your Lama's instruction, you practice them, and it comes about. So that's the virtue by way of application. And we can achieve any realization in that way is the idea. Then a few more. Virtue by way of activity directed in front. Right, and that's where that's essentially the merit field, right? So that's a virtue where you visualize or actually have, either you visualize your merit field, like in the Lama Chopa, or the different, practices where you visualize, like, usually it's your root guru, and the Lama Chopa would be your root guru in the form of all this merit field. But there are various ones like that. And then it says making prostrations or making offerings within the observation of a special field of accumulation or special field of merit. So that's a unique, and then it can also be with an actual, like, so if you go to that would also include if you went to like the monastery and made offerings to the holy beings there, or if you went to a stupa and made offerings, or you go to, so it's in relation to a special object of merit, right? Or if you go to your guru and make offerings to your teacher or whatever, so it's making offerings or prostrations or doing something positive in relation to a special field of merit, meaning holy beings in this case, either visualized or actually present. Then the fourth one is virtue by way of benefiting, and he says for instance actions such as ripening sentient beings by way of the four means of gathering disciples, and those are listed below, right? Giving dharma and material necessities to disciples, speaking pleasantly, applying the meaning by helping them to put into practice the teachings that you've given, so helping them actually practice. And then actually practicing yourself to set a good example, right? And this, this is the example here is of a teacher, like a lama or something, but we can all do that, right? I mean, like if you think of one of them as giving material necessities, so if you're giving somebody, if you're supporting somebody and helping them, that's an example. Or it doesn't have to be a formal Dharma teaching. It could, where it says like helping them practice. So then there's somebody struggling in their practice and you have a conversation and try to help them, that'd be an example of that, right? So it's benefiting beings by helping them, by helping them actually. Yeah, that'd be a simple way to put it. Number 5 is virtue by way of bearing. And he says, is for instance, special wholesome actions which act as a means for attaining high status and definite goodness. So high status means a good rebirth, and definite goodness means enlightenment, whether it be personal liberation or Buddhahood. So this one, special wholesome actions that give rise to like those kinds of results. There are many examples, but one would be, I'm just giving a simple example, taking precepts, right? So an example of sometimes holding, and they sometimes translate bearing as holding. So holding the practice. So an example of that would be like, getting up before dawn and taking the 8 Mahayana precepts. And you dedicate that to enlightenment. That'd be an example of like a special kind of virtue that gives rise to a definite goodness or high status. And then the next one, but virtue by way of acting as an antidote is, for instance, virtuous actions that possess the special power to directly destroy the object of abandonment of the discordant class. So these are particular kind, right? This is a particular kind of virtue. They're different than some of the others. Here we're talking about a meditative equipoise on emptiness, right? That's a special kind of virtue that can actually eliminate, abandon the discordant classes, means the mental afflictions, right? So there are other, above, like application. An example of application might be, think about it, let's say you have a lot of craving and attachment and desire. You might, one example of application might be thinking about impermanence, right? Like saying, oh, the things I'm grasping are impermanent. I shouldn't grasp so much because everything's impermanent. I'm impermanent. The objects I grasp at are impermanent. That would be a form of application. But then there's a unique form, you could say it's a unique form of application, is which acts as an actual antidote, would be meditating on emptiness, right? Which can actually eliminate the root of those mental afflictions. So That's where he says it possess a special power, right? So it's a meditative equipoise on emptiness. Then virtue by way of pacification is explained to be, for instance, the true cessations, and then it says, just as it said in the stanza Homage to the Dharma, purity separating from attachment, virtue liberating from the bad migrations, unique, ultimate, supreme, pacifying Dharma. So this one, just to connect, I just want to differentiate something from number 6, right? Number 6 is a meditative, you could say an example of that would be a meditative equipoise on emptiness. Number 7, an example of that would be the true cessation that comes about as a result of that. Does that make sense? So that when you meditate on emptiness and you realize, for example, when you realize emptiness on the path of seeing, right? We have a meditative equipoise on the path of seeing, which serves as an antidote to certain mental afflictions, right? Where they are permanently eliminated. And then when you're while you're still on the path of seeing, you achieve cessation. And there's a particular cessation that happens, which are the cessation of the, what's it called? Like acquired mental afflictions, like acquired wrong understandings. Like, so it means like that you can't any longer give rise to like a belief in wrong doctrines. Does that make sense? Like your ability to sort of believe in false doctrines falls away. That would be a cessation. Does that make sense? So there's a meditative number 6 would, an example of number 6 would be that meditative equipoise, realizing emptiness. But then number 7, an example of that would be the actual cessations that have come about as a result of that. And later on the path, I'll give an example, on the path of meditation, there comes a point where somebody's meditating on emptiness and they achieve a cessation of anger. They can no longer give rise to anger, right? That would be an example of a cessation. Does that make sense? So, so there's a difference between number 6 and number 7. And in one way, number 6 is the means and number 7 is the actual cessation that comes about through that means. And then the last of this list, number 8, virtue by way of concordant cause, for instance, the 5 clairvoyances, the 10 powers that arise through the force of attaining true cessations. So these would be like unique powers of Aryas, the examples here, right? The 10 powers are unique to a Buddha, actually. Only Buddhas have the 10 powers. So anyway, those would be unique virtues that are kind of resultant results of practice, you could say, result after the true cessations. So that was a list of 8, sort of, but I guess I want to step back. First, I want to make more comment, and I'll see if there are any questions. What I'm going to step back and just point out is, again, where I started. So these 8, if you contemplate them, what are they saying? They're saying that, first of all, there are a number of implications. One is you can achieve any virtue, but you have to cultivate it, right? And if you didn't cultivate it in past lives, you have to cultivate it in this life, right? Even if you cultivated some in past lives, you cultivate the others in this life. And if you make effort, then you can achieve these different kinds of results. And it's up to you, right? You can do, it's like, and you can choose for yourself, right? Do you want to do the ones, for example, the virtues directed in front, right? Visualizing the merit field, or do you want to focus on a virtue that's benefiting others, right? At any given point in your life, or do you want to focus on bearing, right? Like doing, so going off and doing some practices intensively, right? And bearing could be a retreat, going off and doing a retreat, for example. So it's up to you. And my point is it's like a list. This is like, actually, you could say, I'm going to use a funny metaphor here. It's a menu, right? This is like a menu. We often go to like, I'm much more familiar with like menus at restaurants, right? Like which are for, that's not for virtue. This is a menu of virtues, right? So you get to pick them. So like, and one way of looking at what Kachin Geshe Gyaltsen is saying actually is like, your life, our lives should be spent on these things, actually, right? Like, so which one do I want to do today, right? Which one do I want to do this year? We have a new year coming up, right? You would look and go, oh, wow, which virtues do I want to focus on next year? So for a day, for a week, for a month, for a year. And what an implication of all that is if you're not focusing on anything on that list, right, then you're on the wrong menu or something. You're choosing from the wrong menu, would be the implication. And you'll end up with indigestion. Joking. But, these are the causes of happiness. What he's saying is virtue is the cause of happiness. So practice some kind of virtue, whether that virtue is working for the benefit of others, creating merit, doing retreat, applying yourself to gaining realizations. That's in accordance with your dispositions and your habits or whatever, but choose some virtue is the idea here. Okay, Ryan had his hand up first.
Hey, So I see what you mean about them, being kind of like a menu of things you can choose to acquire virtue, but they also kind of seem to follow each other in the sense that, like, you're not going to achieve by way of application unless you already have the karma by which you're going to pursue that in this life. You're not going to you know teach and train disciples unless you have a good practice, and you're already doing prostrations and offerings, and your practice is strong. Then you're going to do that, and then they connect even closer later on between antidote, pacification, and concord and cause. But they kind of do seem to follow each other, where you're not going to do a later one unless you've already done an earlier one, and then you can go back and pick and choose. But you're not going to jump to the end there without doing the beginning work. Is that right?
No, you're right. Yeah, some of them were not like some of them were not like some of them I would have to look and go, well, I'm not capable of, in other words, I'm not yet able to generate certain ones, right? But if we keep practicing, yeah, you're right. So so the more adept you become a practice, the more the bigger the menu you have. Is one, yeah. So I think you're right. Yep. Oh, and then Wilhelmina has her hand up. Wilhelmina, you want to go? You can go ahead. You have to unmute though.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, you got it.
I'm have the same kind of question that the previous Ryan had, because in the big scheme of things, there's the path of accumulation, and I looked at that this week. And then you have the path of preparation, and then you have the path of seeing. Now I looked at that, and I have a little bit from here to, but some things are happening. So you stay with that first before you move on to the next one, or how do you see that? How does that work? Because I was wondering, where for heaven's sake am I, on the path? I need to know right now because I feel the need for it. So what to do? What's the general idea?
I guess one thing I'll say in general is this: is like if you think about from like the one so the ones that are attained at birth. I was making a few points here. The ones that were attained at birth, of course, we had to have made the effort in a past life. So there's not much we can do now, about that one. Whatever we have, naturally we have, but on that already, because we did or didn't make effort in past lives. But I'll make a point here. If you think about it from a perspective of the 5 paths, which is what you were mentioning, Wilhelmina, then really our focus, I think, has to be numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, doesn't it? Because and if you think about like the way we actually, and in terms of our actual practice, if we're an ordinary person, right, who's not on the path of seeing, for example, as it says here, right, to generate bodhicitta, for example, is application, right? And if we're trying to overcome certain mental afflictions, that's application, right? If we're trying to cultivate an understanding of emptiness, that's application, right? We listen to our guru and then we contemplate, the different reasonings for emptiness, that's application. But then one point I want to make is that we also have to mix that, don't we? Like, so, because if you think of like the instructions that Lama Tsongkhapa received from Manjushri, he made a certain points, which are that one of them was that it's not enough, of course, just to do application alone. John asks, we're on page 49 now. So like when Lama Tsongkhapa had like a vision of Manjushri, Manjushri gave him some instruction, which I think is related here, which is that you have to also accumulate merit and do purification, right? Or your application, there'll be obstacles, right? So that's the example would be activity directed in front. So you do the 7-limb practice, for example, right? And that's to help enhance your application. I remember one time I was talking to, this is just a like everyday story. It wasn't like a Dharma teaching, but I was, one day I was chatting with Tashi, Kensho Rinpoche's, Geshe Tashi, who's Kensho Rinpoche's attendant and helper. And he was saying he was talking about the activity directed in front. He wasn't using that phrase, but he was saying, when the monks go off to do retreat, which is application, right? He was saying like, first they have to do like all these different like Nundro practices and 7 limb practices and so on. And he said, otherwise they'll have so many obstacles in their retreat that they won't have success, and they've learned that through experience. And then I asked him like, oh, is that true of so-and-so? And he said, oh yeah, they did that. They did all the Nundros and they did different, to get ready. And I said, oh, how about this person? And he said, oh yeah, and if they didn't, still they would be like obstacles. So you have to like accumulate virtue and overcome, practice purification. And then I said to him, is that true of Khensa Rinpoche? And he said, oh, no, not for Khensa Rinpoche. It was funny. Like that Khensa Rinpoche was like an exception to that rule, was his point, which he you should know that. It was a very sweet moment. Like, that's obvious, isn't it? But in general, one has to do these like activities directed in front, or the application itself won't work. And then bearing, right? That's like where, so we have to do that also, don't we? Because and actually that's like that we sometimes need to do like these special practices, right? It's like, so you do some kind of intensive thing, or you're having, and I don't know, sometimes also do you have that like, Wilhelmina, I know you're like this, where you have like an intuition, oh, I need to do this particular, if you've received some initiation or some teaching, then you have some intuition, oh, I need to do that practice now, some special practice to overcome or to kind of generate, well, in this case, it would be to create a certain kind of cause, right? In this case, for good rebirths, for example. And then benefiting, of course, like that's like comes when we that we all have to do that too, don't we? Like I'm just talking about as ordinary practitioners, because what we're talking about is that when there's somebody in need, you can't just say, oh, I'm just doing application, right? Like, so we have to, so I think those ones, application, directed in front, benefiting, and bearing, are the ones that we as like people, and then the other ones after that, right? The acting as an antidote, pacification, and concordant cause. Let me going back to your point, those more come on the paths of seeing, right, and meditation. So those are more like, and those are the activity of practitioners and bodhisattvas. But one isn't capable of those until one achieves that level, right? So like the direct antidote, for example, that gives rise to cessations, those only happen on the path of seeing and meditation and no more learning. They don't happen on the path of accumulation or even preparation. So those are for more exalted people who have more exalted capacity, So does that answer your question though?
I would like one more.
Okay.
When I look at the path of preparation, it talks about heat, and then it talks about peak.
Yeah.
And I don't know what peak means.
Oh, I see.
Is that the peak of the heat, or is it?
So I'm trying to remember the exact. There's there are 4 parts, right?
The next one is forbearance,
and then
says
supreme mundane dharma. Then, right?
It says here SMQ.
Supreme mundane, SM, supreme mundane quality, or supreme mundane.
Okay.
So that's like the most, so those are what happens. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember the exact cutoffs of each one, but what happens on the path of, like, so if you're on the path of accumulation, if you're on Mahayana, when you're on the path of accumulation, you've generated bodhicitta.
Right.
But the path of preparation starts when you achieve the union of calm abiding and special insight. So the person on the path of preparation, first of all, already on the path, they have to have previously cultivated and succeeded in cultivating calm abiding. So they've already.
That's kind of calm abiding. Oh,
calm
okay.
abiding, yeah.
Okay.
And then using calm abiding, they realize selflessness or emptiness. And so when you first realize the union of calm abiding and special insight, you've achieved heat. That's the beginning of the path of preparation. And then basically then what happens is, if you think about it, when you've realized the union of calm abiding and special insight, you achieve the path of preparation. And then the whole process of the path of preparation is that realization still has a conceptual quality. There's still a little bit of dualism in your realization of emptiness for that bodhisattva. So those different levels of those 4 levels, what they mainly are that the practitioner is, one way of saying it is that the conceptuality is getting subtler and subtler of their realization of emptiness. So it's getting closer and closer to a direct realization. And therefore the power of that realization to overcome the mental, to temporarily subdue the mental afflictions is getting more and more strong. So that's what that is like, it's like these different levels of strength of their realization of emptiness. and the more subtle, it's getting like more and more subtle, their understanding of emptiness. They already understood it and realized it, but now it's getting like more powerful. The conceptuality is getting like thinner and thinner. And then this, I can't remember the exact definitions of each cutoff point, but then the supreme mundane dharma is when they're at the point just before they realize emptiness directly. So it's like a process where they're getting like, they've already realized emptiness with calm abiding, but their realization, you could say that two things. One is that their realization, the conceptuality is getting like flimsier or thinner, like a veil that's being kind of worn away. And then also the ability of that realization to overcome the mental afflictions and to give rise to positive qualities is getting stronger. And finally, at supreme mundane dharma, it's like the moment right before they break through and realize emptiness non-conceptually, which is the path of seeing. That's when the path of seeing begins. So that's what those are, is like a process like that.
Thank you. That is so helpful.
Oh, good. Yeah, and later I could look up. There's exact sort of definitions of when one ends and the next begins. I don't remember the exact.
Yeah, I'm
That's
just
general.
I'm just curious about the peak, what that means.
Yeah,
The
and I'm trying to
peak.
remember like
But there's no hurry.
I'll look that up. I'll look it up for next time. I don't remember the exact cutoff point when it goes from heat to
Right.
peak to forbearance, but that's the general process, though. Yeah.
Okay, I just needed to get some clarity. Thank you.
Not sure. And it looks like Lynn has a question or comment. Yeah.
Well, I had sort of a follow-on on both questions. Is 6? Well, this is what I struggle with. I think, okay, I'm negating some attachment, okay, like anger or pride or something like that, and I do it. I get to a space where I feel like I do it, and then I'm really proud of myself for doing it. So I'm clearly not in number 6, but the question is, am I even in number? Yeah, I'm clearly not number 7, but the question is, do you have to directly realize emptiness before you get to number 6? Because it says directly destroy the objects of abandonment. In other words, if you destroy it, at least in a temporal sense, so you don't feel them, experience them, you feel like there's an emptiness, is that directly realizing, destroying them, or is that the stage before you directly destroy them?
I think I'll say it this way, like my opinion, I guess I'll say, I'll say my own view on that, would be that I think that number 6, because it says special power to directly destroy the objects of abandonment and the discordant class, that's referring, I think, to direct realization of emptiness. So I think when we're doing kind of a more, like let's say through just meditating on emptiness, but without a direct realization, I think that would be virtue by way of application. So number 2, and I'll give an example going back to our text, is that would be an example. Like I'll give an example. I want to go back to yeah. I'll give an example of effort, right? One of the virtuous qualities was effort, which is enthusiasm or effort. I'm going to read Geshe Rabten. Is a mental factor that acts as an antidote to laziness and joyously engages in wholesome activity. And it cultivates. So my point is that there are numerous, like effort would be an example of one, and there are others. No, non-hatred, right, would be an example, and non-attachment. So the one you gave where you said it was attachment, right? So if somebody is practicing non-attachment, right, then they would be doing number 2, which is applying themselves to a virtue, right, through effort. They'll be making effort and doing number 2. And then if you actually succeed in temporarily sort of eliminating attachment from your mind, that would be an example of a positive practice of application, doing application. So in your example, right, where like, so let's say, I recognize, oh, wow, I have this kind of attachment. And then I go meditate on emptiness of myself and of the object I'm attached to. And I experientially kind of eliminate the attachment through that meditation. That I would think that's number 2, because I'm applying myself to cultivating a specific virtue, which in this case would be non-attachment is one of the virtues, right? And then one other point I'll make, so that would be, I think, number 2. And then when you feel the pride, I would ask, like, one thing I'll say is, you have to differentiate also. If it's rejoicing, that's still virtue, right? If you say, oh, excellent, I'm like, if you're actually feeling, wow, attachment was a cause of suffering, I meditated on emptiness, I succeeded in suppressing or overcoming that attachment, and that's a kind of joy, that's a virtue. Now, if we go switch into a kind of pride of a self, what's the word? That's overly self-focused, let's say, we'll get into pride in a few minutes, it's actually one of the mental non-virtues. Then we've, then that's normal. We also then we've succeeded in overcoming one mental affliction, but then given rise to another mental affliction, then we have to apply the antidote to that one. So it depends. It could be rejoicing, and all I'm trying to pointing out is this: I think that's application, and in your example, it would be the application using non-attachment, which is a virtue. But then also, once you feel that pride, I would ask, that could be a virtuous mental factor of joy, rejoicing, or it could be actual pride, and we have to differentiate that.
But how do I say this? I wouldn't think rejoicing would be a virtuous mental factor.
Oh, well, actually, I should change it. Rejoicing is a virtuous practice. That's the better way to put it.
A virtuous practice. Okay.
Sorry, I should have said it that way. Yeah, rejoicing is a virtuous practice that increases our merit. So, in other words, so it's like if we rejoice, if we do let's say a person overcomes attachment in a given practice, and then they really feel, oh, that's wonderful. That's giving me peace of mind. It's making the world a better place. One less attached person. That's what the world needs. That. If you're feeling like that, that's good. Actually, they would say that's a virtuous practice, or a practice that creates more merit. Whereas if you start to think more like, well, I'm better than all these other practitioners. They have a lot of attachment and I don't. I'm better than them. Then that's pride, and that's not helpful. So that's all. I was just differentiating those two states.
Okay.
But in general, your question, I think that what you're describing would be application there to one of the virtuous mental factors, which is what our practice is, right? In that case, since you gave the example, or if the example were attachment, it'd be non-attachment. If the example were hatred, it'd be if the example were anger, it'd be non-hatred. But it would be, so that would be application, cultivating one of the virtuous mental factors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And any other comments or questions before we go on? All right, so and I think that ends the section on the 11 virtues, right? Yeah, the 11 virtues explained above are either actual or designated. And then it starts a discussion of non-virtues. And so it starts with the same categorization as the virtues now, but for non-virtue. It says, similarly, non-virtues are taught to be of 5 types. Non-virtues by way of entity, by way of relation. Well, let's read each one. So non-virtues by way of entity are mostly the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions. So we're going to go through those. We have them here, the 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions, and they all come in this text. They're all going to be described. So what it's saying is the very entity of those 26 mental factors are non-virtuous. That's the first point, is what it's saying. I want to put forward just this. I don't want to dwell on this, but I want to put forward a question just to think. We'll get into it later a little bit more. Or actually, there are afflictions, right? But it says non-virtues, right? So I'm just going to ask a debate question for a second. Is that true? If you have one of the root or secondary mental afflictions, is it necessarily non-virtuous? And I'll answer my own questions. I'll say I don't think so, because I'll give an example. Ignorance grasping at true existence. Right? When we ordinary people do virtuous actions, we still have ignorance grasping at true existence. So then we're doing virtue. So anyway, that's a question. We'll get into it more when we get to that section. But I'll debate for a second and say, I would argue that not all not all minds where the root afflictions are present are non-virtues, because ordinary people who haven't realized emptiness yet do virtue, right? That's how you create a good rebirth. So anyway, but here it's making a valid point in general, which is the entity of these mental afflictions is non-virtuous. Then non-virtues by way of relation are minds and mental factors that are concomitant with those afflictions. So that's an example. What is he getting at there? He's saying, if you're, remember we said this when we were covering the I'm going back, mental factors like concentration or intention, discrimination, and so on. You know, whether those are virtuous or non-virtuous depends upon whether you have a virtuous, you know, one of the 11 virtues present or one of these 26 non-virtues. So an example would be, if you're filled with hatred, right? Let's say your mind is overcome with hatred. Your attention, your concentration, your discrimination are all non-virtuous at that moment, right? All your other mental factors that are present are also non-virtuous, it's saying, because they're concomitant with, they're coexisting with hatred, and so that makes them non-virtuous, is what he's saying. So it's not just the hatred itself that's non-virtuous, but it's also the way you discriminate, the way you know, your process of making discriminations at that time are associated with non-virtue and therefore are non-virtuous. Then there are non-virtues by way of subsequent relation, which are the imprints of non-virtue, right? Which we leave in our mind every time we cultivate it. Every time we allow ourselves, you could say, to give rise to a non-virtue, we're also making imprints of non-virtue. So which will then give rise to their results, which is part of the problem. Then non-virtues by way of motivation are the physical and verbal actions motivated by those afflictions, right? So that would be a non-virtue, you know, so if first you give rise to, give some example, hatred, you know, and then you go harm somebody, that would be, let's say if you harm them verbally, let's say you shout at them and insult them, right? The verbal action of shouting and insulting is a non-virtue that's motivated by the hatred, right? So the mental factor in that case would be hatred, but then also the verbal action is also a non-virtue. And same thing, right? If you steal out of greed, right? The greed is the mental factor, a non-virtuous mental factor, but then there's a physical action of stealing that's also non-virtuous. And then non-virtues by way of ultimacy are phenomena included within cyclic existence. These are the sources from which superiors, meaning Aryas, generate despondency. They are called non-virtues by way of ultimacy. Nonetheless, it is not definite that everything included in cyclic existence is an actual non-virtue. So what's that saying? You know, actually what that's saying is that, you know, if a phenomena is samsaric, right, meaning what we say impure, right, which means arisen due to karma and mental afflictions. He's making an interesting point. I just want to point out a couple quick things here. One is, it says the sources from which Aryas, superiors, generate despondency. We usually think of despondency as a bad thing, don't we? Oh, I'm despondent. We say that's terrible. Nobody should ever be despondent, right? This text, in accordance with Dharma, is saying sometimes it's good to be despondent, right? In other words, to be despondent with, you know, it's like I sometimes think of this as an analogy, you know, like I'm just using an analogy here. If somebody's an addict, right, and then they become despondent with their own experience and process in regards to this, what they're addicted to, that's a good thing, right? So sometimes despondency is really good. And what this is saying is, you know, great spiritual beings become despondent with the causes of suffering, right? And so that's what this is saying is so when spiritual practitioners look at the causes of suffering, they become despondent and think, oh, this is like not working. This is terrible. And that's a constructive despondency. And so that's a kind of, and that would be, what's the word? They become despondent with all that is samsara. And then it's pointing out here, it's saying, nonetheless, it's not definite that everything included within samsara is an actual non-virtue. And what they're getting at there, I just want to point out, is that from an Arya's perspective, they would look at even the virtues that ordinary people do and say, oh, that's like, it's just giving rise to more samsara, right? You know, so like what they're getting at is, there is virtue that is within samsara, right? If you practice generosity with no awareness of emptiness, let's say, right? That's a virtue, that's a genuine virtue, but it's not an antidote to samsara. So it's that would be an example where it says it's not definite everything included in samsara is an actual non-virtue. Would be if an ordinary person who hasn't realized emptiness practice generosity, that will give rise to a good result. That's a good thing, it's a virtue. But still, from an Arya's perspective, they would look at that and say, well, it's better than, being generous is better than being miserly, but the result is still more samsara, because they're not applying the antidote to samsara itself, which would be wisdom, right? And so they would still look at that and say, it's still suffering. It's still in the nature of suffering, actually, isn't it? So it's a virtue, but it's still, you could say, it's a virtue, but it's still in the nature of the second kind of suffering, actually, right? The suffering of, it's actually the last two. It's the suffering of, it's not, the result of a virtuous karma is not the suffering of suffering, right? But it is the suffering of change and the suffering of the compounded aggregates. So anyway, so that's getting at the meaning there. And then he goes on. It also appears that in regard to the non-virtues explained above, there are many distinctions to be made between actual and designated regarding their divisions and functions. And we'll get into that more. Part of that is what I was getting at earlier. Are all the non-virtues actually, he's going to address that more. Are all the if everything, I made that point, right? Not all, it says non-virtues by way of entity are mostly the root afflictions and secondary afflictions. But that's why it says mostly, and now he's saying there are other ways of defining it, because I give the example, right? If somebody does a virtue under the influence of ignorance, there's a mental affliction there, but it's also a virtue. So there are like fine distinctions that can be drawn, and we'll get into them later. And then he gives another, and this we won't go through in much detail, but then he says when non-virtues are divided in terms of circumstances, there are, and this is similar to the list we just did, so we don't need to take too long on it, but non-virtue way of attainment at birth is, for instance, instinctively engaging in murder through mere rebirth due to the imprints from past lives. At the time of debating on words such as these, the action of killing, for instance, is posited as a non-virtue. If the engagement in killing is accepted to be a non-virtue, then debate ensues. However, the classification of virtue and non-virtue here is not presented as debate material for today's new-minded beginners. Rather, it is presented as an essential branch for introducing the virtuous and non-virtuous objects of observation. Therefore, without clinging to mere words, you should turn your mind toward inwards and reflect on how to put it into practice. So he's saying this is not, you get the point here. He's saying this is not a point for philosophical debate. This is a point for practice in your real life. And actually, I just want to ask you to think about something. These categories are here to contemplate. So actually, if you ask yourself, just for you, just for your own, not anybody else, like, what virtues did you have through birth, right? In other words, what were some moments of virtue that just happened? Like, as you were exposed to something and immediately you felt compassion, or you felt faith, or you felt some virtuous thing arise, right? But then also for you, for us, what are your non-virtues through birth, right? Attained at birth. So what are the things that just without cultivating them, you naturally do non-virtuously, right? That it's really easy to give rise to certain non-virtues, right? And I just want to point that out, like, because part of that's what he's getting at here is a point for practice, right? Is like, because it's easy to see, right? There are people who, there are people who at birth want to kill or want to, and so on, right? But what are our own? There's looking at somebody else's doesn't help us, right? And maybe it is killing, whatever it may be, right? But what are the non-virtues that come to you easily and spontaneously, right? And if we're honest with ourselves, it's probably a long list, actually. If we're not Aryas, then it's probably a long list. And the point is of that is this, and again, we're about to go into application. If we don't apply ourselves, then those non-virtues will continue, right? Because those won't go away. Point here is if you have a non-virtue that you're naturally inclined to, it won't go away on its own, right? You, as Lynn was pointing out, you have to apply an antidote, right? She was giving an example of non-attachment, of applying the antidote to attachment. if we don't apply antidotes, those mental afflictions won't, and those non-virtues won't just disappear. So we have to eliminate them. And if we don't, this is the point here, is what he's implying is, if you don't, then you won't achieve liberation, because you can't achieve liberation with the mental affliction. You won't achieve enlightenment. And eventually they'll take us to lower realms, right? That's what they do. That's the function of non-virtues, is to create suffering, right? So they'll create suffering for ourselves, they'll create suffering for others. And that's, so when he says it's direct, he says here, you should turn your mind inwards and reflect on how to put it into practice. To me, I'm trying to imply or say that's, I think, how we begin to do that, right? Is to say, well, this isn't a point for philosophical, sort of debating with somebody else. It's a point to turn our mind inwards and say, what are my non-virtues, right? And and that's Lojong practice, actually. That's mind training practice. So we look inside, we say, what are the non-virtues that I have attained through birth because I've done them in countless previous lives? And if I don't change them and take responsibility for that, and point here is like the Dalai Lama can't take those away from you. The Buddha can't take those away from you. Like no spiritual teacher can take those away from you. We have to do the work because we did those actions in a past life. And if we don't overcome those tendencies and apply the antidotes, then they'll continue on and they'll cause us and others suffering. So that's that. Then non-virtues by way of application is, for instance, misconduct of the three doors that arises and depends upon relying on non-virtuous spiritual guides, listening to counterfeit Dharma doctrine, familiarizing oneself with it through improper mental engagement, and so forth. And one point I just want to make here briefly is this can be actual, like going to a wrong spiritual guide. There are examples in Buddhism of, like, say somebody's teaching animals. They often give an example, right? If somebody were to, like, animal sacrifice or something, or human sacrifice, right? The like actual extreme wrong doctrines. And, if one goes and listens to a teacher of those and then thinks about it and then practices those, that would be an extreme example of this application. But I also want to suggest that application doesn't have to be just, he's giving the example, he says, is for instance, right? But it doesn't have to be a spiritual guide, right? So in other words, if your culture or your subculture or your group you're part of teaches us something that's wrong, and then we apply ourselves to that, we're cultivating non-virtue through the power of application, right? Like, so, isn't that just like if you grew up and somebody told you something, right? And then if you continue to give your attention to that and it's wrong, right? And so like, like, I remember, there are countless examples that aren't there. Like, so somebody tells you growing up, if you're in this culture, right? Well, in my generation, right, when growing up, there was like message, greed is good, right? That was a famous line from a movie, right? If you believe that and then lived your life according to it, that would be non-virtue by way of application, right? Or if we're told, there are countless messages we're told growing up that are wrong, actually. And the point here is we have to take responsibility, right? So if somebody told you a message, if your culture told you a message, if a person told you, a family member, whoever, it doesn't matter who, application, so this is application to non-virtue, right? So in other words, if you give your attention to that, and there are countless, aren't there? If you just pause and think about it, there are countless bad messages. And I'll make one more point here, just because I want to. I like it. It's so, like, I just notice myself doing this, so I'm pointing out because I do it, is I often look at our culture and I look at other people and I say, oh, look, they're believing this wrong message. How stupid of them. The society is saying these stupid things, and look at these idiots, they're believing those wrong messages. And what this point is saying here is that's not very helpful. It's useless. What's actually useful is to go, what are the wrong messages I'm believing, right? From my wrong exposure to them. And how am I then giving wrong attention to those, right? Putting my attention on those wrong messages and thereby familiarizing myself with mental afflictions. Does that make sense? Because that's something I can actually do something about. And actually, that's funny. And for me, one of those is looking at other people. Yeah. Number one, yeah, exactly. But so, and focusing on the faults of others would be one of those cultural messages that I've internalized, and therefore was giving an example I sometimes do. But so the point here is application, when we apply ourselves to non-virtue, is that we internalize wrong messages and then we give our attention to them, and therefore we increase our own mental afflictions. And our job then is to notice what are those messages and how am I giving my attention to them, not how is somebody else, and then how can I reverse that. Then non-virtue by way of activity directed in front is, for instance, offering a blood sacrifice to an image due to adhering to harmfulness, as the doctrine depends upon being deceived by a perverse spiritual guide. But this one would also be, anyway, anything that, this would be, what's the word? Anytime, what's the way to say this? Anytime you give like great respect to a wrong object and then do a wrong practice in relation to it, that would be that. Right? So I mean that he's giving a traditional example of animal sacrifice. But anytime we sort of, what's the word, like make something or someone, and we what's the word, like deify or something, or we project, right? We do that. We sort of we do that with people, we do that with things. And if you're doing it if you're doing that in relation to the teachers of the view of emptiness, that's good. If you're doing that in relation to teachers of bodhicitta, that's good. But if we're doing it in relation to afflicted objects and then offer, oftentimes people offer themselves, don't we? Like people do that, we human beings. Like we, actually I'll just say, like he's giving an example of blood sacrifice, right? But like, yeah, it's just disturbing, isn't it? Like you think about the examples of like where people like direct great devotion to, like, say a wrong leader and then offer themselves to that leader. That would be an example of this. Then non-virtue's way of harming is, for instance, actions harming sentient beings by way of body, speech, and mind. Yeah, I don't know. Depends on the way. Somebody, go back. Somebody asked the question. In front of one, that was true. And then communion in Christian. I suppose actually, Lisa asked, what about communion in Christian churches? I suppose it depends upon what that means to the person, doesn't it? Like so, yeah, it would depend on the meaning, wouldn't it? I'm just in the middle of reading a book about that, where there's this author, actually a former Catholic priest, is describing. Actually, it's interesting. He's describing like the different ways in a different moment. Somebody, so like, that's a question about communion. I'm no expert on that, but he was making an interesting point, which was, there's one moment where he was making a point where at one moment somebody's sort of saying, when they're saying that God is love, something, and then if they're taking that in, that might be quite positive, right? Another hand, if they're thinking my group is good and your group, other groups are bad, let me take that internalized, then that's quite non-virtuous, isn't it? So it depends on what the meaning is to the person, doesn't it? I think when they're doing a practice, so we can't. It's hard to. I'm just reading a book about this, so it's making me contemplate it lately. But but I think that gets at your point, right? If somebody's thinking the meaning of this is universal love, then that would have to be a virtue, right? But if somebody's saying the meaning of this ritual is my group's good and other groups are bad, and everybody should be like my group, or they should die, then that would be a non-virtuous. So it really depends on how the deep meaning to the person doing the ritual, doesn't it? I mean, communion is one example of a ritual, but so I think that's an important point, though, that Buddhism isn't saying that all rituals of other religions are non-virtuous. That wouldn't be the case. But it's saying that it depends on the meaning, right? If the meaning is like by killing an animal, it's good, that's, well, it's causing harm to a being, right? Or whatever. So it depends on the meaning. But I think if the meaning is universal love, then that would be an example where even a Buddhist would say this other religion's ritual is very virtuous. That's wonderful. Whereas if the meaning is kind of he gives the example of animal sacrifice, but it would apply the same thing, right? If the meaning is my group's good and everybody who doesn't do it is bad, then that would be a non-virtuous, for example, even though it's a religious. So I think it depends on the meanings of the people doing it, the ritual. And actually, it's funny, isn't it? Then you could have 10 people doing a ritual, and some would be doing virtue and some would be doing non-virtue. But that's true of Buddhists too, actually. And that's one thing with Buddhism. Buddhism would say the same thing would apply to Buddhist rituals, right? If somebody's doing a Buddhist ritual and they're motivated by bodhicitta, then that's virtue. If somebody's doing a Buddhist ritual and they're motivated by pride or something, then it will be non-virtue. So So it depends on the motivation, I think. And then Sujata has her hand up.
I just wanted to share something that was really moving to me recently was in the movie Mission Joy, which is the making of the Book of Joy, which is dialogue between His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. There's an incredible scene towards the end where they offer each other a much deeper view into the more sacred aspects of their practice. And so His Holiness is like, I think actually talking to him about Tantrayana. And then in response, they do, I think, mass of some kind, and His Holiness receives the sacrament. Like, and so just, it's a pretty powerful thing to watch the Dalai Lama like doing that. And it was really, to see His Holiness engage in communion and like literally drinking the wine even, it was just super humbling for me. So I don't know if just watching that might be moving for folks. It was incredibly, I'm still trying to sort through how much that pulled the wool away from my eyes about my own feelings that I've chosen the right religion, not just for myself, but in general, to see His Holiness do that. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, thanks for sharing that.
You bet.
Yeah, other comments or questions? Where are we up to? Harming. So that's clear, right? Any instance of harming sentient beings by way of body, speech, and mind would be non-virtue. Non-virtue way of bearing is, for instance, projecting and completing actions which yield only suffering results. And that's actually, so that's clear like that. And this comment there, I mean, there are countless examples of that, aren't there? Where people, we engage in a complete negative karmic action, right? And actually those are so easy. I was saying earlier, like Dharma practices are actually hard to do, right? But people consider it quite easy to hold or bear complete negative actions. It's quite easy for ordinary beings to do that. So that'll be that. Then non-true virtues by way of the discordant classes, for instance, bad views that hinder the generation of the uncontaminated paths. So holding on to bad views there. And then non-virtue by way of interference is, for instance, bad views that interfere with all the classes of virtue. And a typical example of that one would be that there's no, nihilism would be the most extreme example, they say, of non-virtue by way of interference, right? So there is, if a person believes, well, whatever I do, it has no, nothing means anything and doesn't really matter, and there's no results to anything, it's all, meaningless. That would be the worst of all bad views, because it interferes with any kind of virtue then, right? Nihilism does that. This is similarly in regard to the unspecified. There are divisions of, that's unspecified karmas, right, or indefinite by way of entity and so on, but he doesn't go into detail about that, so we don't need to. Then he says, this is an interesting sentence. Moreover, there is much to be explained with regard to virtues and non-virtues, such as the aspect which appears to be virtue but is not, the aspect which appears to be non-virtue but is not. However, I will not elaborate on them here. We won't go into great detail, but I think we know what those are, right? Like, so in other words, it's possible to be looking like you're creating virtue while having a mental affliction as your motivation, right? That would appear like virtue, but it's not virtue, right? And then there are examples where something could appear non-virtuous, but it's not, right? That's where if you have if a bodhisattva, the most simple example is if a bodhisattva with bodhicitta is doing something that looks non-virtuous, it's not necessarily non-virtuous, is it? Because it's motivated by love and compassion and bodhicitta. So anyway, it's the point being that it's the motivation in the end is the most important factor in virtue and non-virtue. But actually, part of the point here, though, is the one important point, I think, given the text we're studying is, so the external thing is not the proof. The proof is what's in your own mind, right? And if there's a mental affliction in your mind, it's non-virtue. Does that make sense? If you're just the other day I remember noticing that I was angry about something, and I thought, well, I think my anger is justified, and I had to stop and say, that doesn't really matter. In other words, I'm creating non-virtue, and I'm causing myself suffering, and I'm going to cause others suffering if I act on this. Whether it's virtue, whether it's justified or not, is not the right question. The question is it a cause of happiness or suffering for myself or others? And so you can't lie. It was like you can get around the external question, right? Is it if it's bodhicitta, but you can't. That's right. You can't get around your own mind, if that makes sense. Like, in other words, your mind is what it is, and if there's a mental affliction in your mind, there's a mental affliction in your mind, and that's never a cause of happiness, is what Buddhism is asserting. There's no exception to that, right? And the same way, if there's genuine bodhicitta in your heart, if genuine compassion in your heart, that's a good thing. So those are not things you can cheat or something. You can't get around that. Then it says, if you wish to understand them in detail, you should look at the Abhidharma texts. They go into more detail. And then he quotes a few intermediate stanzas. Despite having encountered the 7 jewels of the superiors that when found bestow all excellent collections in this life and the next, one discards them and strives instead for the meaningless, like the toils of someone winnowing husks. Oh, how silly. While one's eyes of awareness distinguishing paths from non-paths is obscured by the filthy water of foolish misleading words, one wishes to traverse the paths and grounds in reliance upon the walking stick of counterfeit dharma. What a joke. Hey, intelligent, eager friends, if you seek the jewel of enhancing the intention to accomplish the 2 purposes, then follow the supreme helmsman, Lobsang, i.e. Tsongkhapa. You should dive into the wish-granting ocean of the Muni's teachings. So he's just pointing out here what, actually, right? One is, don't waste our lives, right? Don't waste your life on what's meaningless. And then he's suggesting an interesting idea, right? Which is that that it's easy to mistake what's meaningful and what's meaningless. It's easy to get it wrong. And he's saying, so rely on reliable sources for understanding the meaningful, right? And compare your own experience to those meaningful sources, meaning the Dharma of Tsongkhapa and the Muni, or the Buddha, right? He's saying rely on those kinds of explanations in order to understand how to live a meaningful life. And he's implying something here, which is a meaningful life is also mainly an inner life, isn't it? I'll just say a very brief comment here, just like actually in Tibetan Buddhism, if you ever read like biographies, right? Actually, they call them namtar, liberation life stories, right? There's like outer, inner, and secret life stories usually told, right? And like the outer is what the deeds the person did, the inner is their inner realizations and training, and the secret is usually their like Vajrayana accomplishments. But actually, I'll just tell a very brief. Oh, this is fun. I'll tell a very brief story. I remember once when I was at Kopan Monastery, Lama Zopa Rinpoche asked different like lamas and monks and nuns to like share their life stories. Like he would have like one session where he'd ask somebody to share their story. And so most people came up and told their outer story. They said, "Oh well, I went here and then I went there and then I did a retreat or whatever. I went to Nepal. And then he asked Geshe Lama Kunchok, who was a great yogi, to tell his life story. And you could tell Geshe Lama Kunchok didn't want to tell it. He didn't want to talk about himself. But Lama Zopa asked, so he didn't want to say no either. So he came and he just said, I'm getting at what this text is saying. So he came and he said, I know he had done many, he was famous for having done many years of strict retreat and things. He didn't mention any of that. What he just said was, he said things like, I've tried to cultivate an attitude that prefers losing to getting stuff. And that was better when I was alone. Now I'm here with you people, you try to give me Coca-Cola. But I don't care about that. And then he would say, like, I tried to cultivate an attitude that preferred being attacked to being praised. And he would go on like that. He just told it was purely an inner biography. He didn't really tell anything external about his life. He just told like his genuine inner biography. He said, I tried to like cultivate a mind that didn't mind hardships, basically things like that. And he didn't tell anything that he had done externally. And then he said, that's it. And he walked out, what he's saying here, I'm telling you, I don't remember the exact every detail of what he said, of course, but I think what this text is saying here in this section is what you do externally is not what's important, actually. I mean, it is important to the extent that it helps others, but it's only important if it's motivated by virtue, right? If what you do, even if you do a lot of stuff, if it's not motivated by love and compassion, this text would say, who cares? And if what matters is your inner biography, which is, have you decreased your mental afflictions and have you increased your virtuous mental factors? And meaningless, I think what he's saying is that's a meaningful life, right? In the context of this text is what he's saying. And so you have to understand what are the virtues, what are the non-virtues, and then you live a meaningful life by changing your own mind, right? And your external action should be a natural reflection of that, not a pretense, but a natural reflection of an inner process, right? And that's a meaningful life, I think, is what he's implying. That accomplishes the two purposes, right? The two purposes being your own and others. So anyway, but Ryan has his hand up.
Yeah, I've had this conversation so many times with people I know, mostly non-Buddhists, about like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos and people who give billions and billions and billions of dollars, or who say like, before I die, I'm going to give away my billions of dollars. And I'm always stressing the point, like what it just resonates what you just said here, because the point I'm always trying to make is, but what motivates it is what matters. You could, so like becoming a billionaire and then giving away $900 million, is great, but it really only matters as to what it's motivated by. Is it motivated by you want your name on the university building, legacy, or is it motivated by genuine compassion for other people? You can be the richest person in the world and give more money than anybody in the world, but if it's motivated by anything other than compassion or love, then it doesn't matter. And anyway, you just right saying that, they're just reminding me, I've had this conversation constantly. So thanks.
Yeah, no, that's what Buddhism's suggesting, isn't it? Yeah. All right, so now we have some. Sorry, so we'll start on the 6 root afflictions. So these are like, and anyway, yeah. So these are the 6 root afflictions, and there'll be 20 secondary mental afflictions. So the 6 root afflictions are attachment, anger, pride, ignorance, doubt, meaning afflicted doubt, and afflicted views. Then he says, regarding the general defining characteristic of afflictions, the Abhidharma, the Compendium of Knowledge, says, the definition of an affliction is a phenomena such that when it arises, the characteristic of being very unpeaceful arises. And due to its arising, the mental continuum arises as being very unpeaceful. Then he says, just as it has been said above, it is an awareness that causes the mental continuum to be very unpeaceful when it arises. And I just want to share a couple more points here. So other translators, they hear the saying unpeaceful, and other lamas will use different words. The mind becomes unclear, it becomes agitated. There's a traditional metaphor where it's like water in a pond where the dirt has been stirred up, so it's like murky. And Geshe Rabten says about this topic of general, the 6 root mental afflictions, he says, the mental afflictions are responsible for every form of suffering and discontent that we experience. They are conceptual mental factors that upon arising in the mind cause disturbance and unrest. So it's just different terms, right? Unpeace, disturbance, unrest. So that's the general characteristic, right? And I just want to say, I want to share just a thought here, which is, he gives that general definition to start. I want to suggest that we all contemplate that a little bit as we go through them. And it'll take, we'll only go through probably one today, but to contemplate that general definition, because it's actually kind of funny, isn't it? notice, I guess what I want to say is notice your own experience. Because I think what's true is that, say it strictly. If my mind, your mind, if a person's mind is very familiar with a certain mental affliction, then we won't recognize that it's a cause of unpeace usually. There is like, and I'll give an example, like people who are, I'm going to give an extreme example here, like somebody who's like whose mind is extremely familiar with hatred, right? They'll think, well, hatred's normal. And then if you say to them, you should give up hatred, they'll become angry. They'll become angry. So they don't recognize, the person doesn't recognize that hatred is causing unpeace for them, right? And my point, though, is that that's true for all of us. Like maybe hatred for some of it, but whatever your mental afflictions are that you're most familiar with at a given time will seem familiar to you, and we oftentimes don't recognize that it's causing our mind unpeace. So as we go through them, like, Lama Zobarshi said that. He says like he's noticed that, when people are very attached, right? And then if he says, oh, cultivate non-attachment, then they can feel like upset, because it seems like attachment's their best friend or something. We're about to cover attachment, right? So that doesn't, here's what Buddhism is saying is, if you actually slow down and really notice in your own experience, these are in the nature of agitation, of discontent, of unrest, of disturbance. But if you don't slow down enough, you won't notice that. Does that make sense? So you have to first understand what are the mental afflictions. Then you have to look at your own experience and see, is it true that they're in the nature of disturbance? And you have to check that for yourself. But I just think it's an important point in the text, is that all the mental afflictions, that Buddhism is asserting psychologically that all the mental afflictions are in the nature of unpeace, of agitation, of unclarity, of disturbance, of discontentment. And so now you can check for yourself. Does that fit with your experience, right? Does that make sense? I just want to emphasize that point. This is a point for contemplation. So you have to check for yourself. And at first, if you think, actually, yeah, if you feel, well, I don't want to give up that. That's a good point for then actually stay with that. You see what I'm getting at? Then that's the one to stay with. Is go with, like, really focus on, wow, why? And do I disagree with what the Buddha and Lama Tsongkhapa are saying? If so, why? Is it really is attachment in the nature of bliss and joy, or is it in the nature of suffering? That we have to check your own experience. Each of us have to check our own experience. So then it says, regarding attachment, the compendium of knowledge, and by the way, attachment is the translation here. Art translates this one as desire in his book. But, you choose your own. Geshe Rabten translates it as attachment also. So it says, what is attachment? And it says, it is clinging of the three realms. It has the function of producing suffering. So that's the definition here. And then, let's just read the next paragraph. Then it says, just as has been said above, it is a mental factor that perceives a contaminated thing to be attractive by way of its own entity and thereupon seeks it. So I want to clarify here, right? So the three realms are the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. Right? So it could be anything in samsara is one point. And then here it says contaminated. So contaminated means arisen due to the karma and mental afflictions, right? So it's a thing that's not in the nature of enlightenment, right? And so one perceives that thing to be attractive. And where it says by way of its own entity, one point that they make in the commentary is that's not referring to emptiness. What that's referring to is an exaggeration. That we think the thing is attractive from its own side, by way of that its very nature is to be attractive. And that its nature, that in that thing is a nature of attractiveness. So there's an exaggeration is the implication here. And then I'll read a couple of the Geshe Rabten says, when referring to a contaminated phenomena, this mind of attachment over-exaggerates its attractiveness and then proceeds to wish for and take a strong interest in it. It acts as a basis for discontentment. And Art, in his translation of Vasubandhu says, he translates attachment as desire. So he says, what is desire? And he says, it is an attachment grasping at the 5 aggregates. Those, and then he makes an interesting point. He says, Vasubandhu does. He says, the aggregates arise from grasping, are governed by grasping, and grasping arises from them. So, and that, yeah, we'll go into more about that in a minute. But so the point here is that, so what is attachment? So attachment is a mind, right? It is when the mind is focused on an object. That object has to be something within samsara, right? So one of the 3 realms. And so contaminated, right? So that, and what does that mean, contaminated? It means within samsara means it's in the nature of suffering, right? So one is looking at an object that's in the nature of suffering and viewing it to be attractive by way of its own entity. So one is exaggerating the attractiveness of the object, and that serves as a basis for discontentment and for mental agitation and for lack of peace. So that's the, I'm just going through, like, that's what attachment is, right? And this quality of exaggeration, right? I'll go through, there are usually sometimes there are 4 in actually Chandrakirti has this in his text, Nagarjuna talks about it. There are 4 wrong concepts of exaggeration. One is seeing the impermanent as permanent, seeing what is suffering as pleasurable, seeing what is repulsive as attractive, and seeing that which was without a self as having a self. So those are, one or more of those are often there in our attachment. And another point here is that, so we all have attachment. Actually, we're in the desire realm. We all, until you're, yeah, anyway, so we're all in the desire realm. So, and even if you're not in the desire realm, you have attachment, because we'll get into it in a minute. But so we're exaggerating the qualities of objects. We're viewing that which is a cause of suffering as a cause, as a nature of happiness. And we're viewing things as existing that way by way of their own entity, right? And let's pause there and reflect on this together for a couple minutes. One point that's often made is, if anything were attractive by way of its own entity, it would be attractive to all beings, right? But and it would also always be attractive to you, but it's not, right? And so you have to check your own experience. Part of the definition here is that when you see that object, notice your own experience. You feel, the feeling is, I want, as he says, taking a strong interest in that object, wanting that object, right? Wanting to possess it or wanting not to be separated from it. And there's some exaggeration, I'll call it a projection, that object is attractive and therefore is a source of pleasure from its own side, right? And I'm just pausing, like, so we do that all the time, don't we? Is one point, right? With regards to, and I want to point out to you here that we do it with regards to physical objects, we do it with regards to other people, we do it with regards to concepts and ideas, we do it with regards to all kinds of things, right? And I'm sort of pausing to, I'm not sure how much in detail to go with this, but I think the key points I just want to emphasize are, it involves distortion, always. So attachment always involves distortion and exaggeration. And attachment by its very nature, going back to what we said earlier, is unpeaceful or disturbing and gives rise to discontentment. So part of the contemplation here would be, what am I attached to, right? And is that, and do I recognize that I'm distorting? And when you think about the antidotes that are taught in Buddhism, they're just taught to overcome parts of those distortions, right? So if you look in traditional Buddhist texts, right, they'll say meditate on the impermanence of the object. Why? Because we view what we're attached to as if it were permanent, though it's not. Right? They'll say meditate on the unattractive qualities of that object. Right? Why? Because we're exaggerating. It's as a compensation for our exaggeration. Right? Ultimately, meditate on the selflessness of the object. Right? Because those are, there are many different antidotes to attachment. But really, those antidotes are ways of trying to counteract our initial misconception and exaggeration. Does that make sense? So we're trying to counteract an exaggeration, which we all do. We exaggerate when we're attached, and it's the very nature of attachment. So now that leads to the next quote, which is from Tsongkhapa. So he says, attachment observes an external or internal object, right? So that's why I said it could be a concept, an idea, right? We can become attached to some idea, or we can become attached to external things or people. So attachment observes an external or internal object that is beautiful and attractive, and then becomes attached to it. For example, just as oil that is soaked into a piece of cloth is difficult to remove, likewise, attachment spreads on and adheres to its object of observation and makes it difficult to tear oneself away from it. The Abhidharma says it's difficult to separate the mind from the object. So this is getting at the experience, right? Where it's like once we become attached to something, it's like it feels like that. Like it's so hard to pull your mind apart from that object. It's only because of a habit, right? Of your mind habituating to viewing that object as attractive and kind of soaking into it. One other point that's interesting, I just want to point out is Lama Tsongkhapa says, right, attachment observes an external or internal object that is beautiful and attractive, right? But not by way of its own entity. I just want to point something out, right? It's appearing as beautiful and it's appearing as beautiful and attractive due to your karma. Does that make sense? So due to a karmic relationship of causes and conditions, something is temporarily taking on an appearance of being beautiful or attractive. But what happens, right? We, not just you, we all then who are attached assume or wrongly conceive that attractiveness to be a quality of the object, not a projection of our karma, right? And then we exaggerate and assume that that object will always be that way, will actually be a source of happiness. And part of the implication here, I just want to point out, is that it's kind of disturbing in a way, if you think about it, right? Because you created a positive karma in the past, right? A contaminated. This is why I was saying not all good karma can be good karma, and it leads to pleasant experiences, but only uncontaminated good karma leads to nirvana, right? So what's the process here? Because you did a good action in the past, right? You have a pleasant experience, an experience that's pleasurable, right? That's a result of your karma. But we think it's the result of whatever we're perceiving in that moment, right? And so we become attached to that object of experience as if it's a source of happiness, which it isn't, right? Then our mind soaks into that object and won't separate from it. Then, because of that, we're attached and we create negative karma through the force of attachment, which causes suffering. And that's part of how samsara, becomes a vicious cycle of continuation, right? Whereas if you recognized, oh, wow, I had a pleasant experience due to the result of past good karma. How wonderful. Let me go create more good karma. That wouldn't be attachment, right? That'd be like, oh, great. That was nice. That this appearance was pleasant. How great. Now let me go do more good karma. That's not attachment, right? Attachment comes when we believe that the good, pleasant experience comes about through the power of the attractiveness of that object of experience through its own entity, as it says, right? We exaggerate and distort in that way. And then we do all kinds of things, right? And if it's another, and you see what, you know this, right? Like, I'll just make one more quick point and I won't dwell too long. But, oftentimes Buddhists will point this out, that sometimes we confuse love and attachment. And actually, and I hope it's very clear, they're completely different, aren't they? The entity, love is a mental factor that wishes for the happiness of another, right? Attachment is a mental factor that grasps and holds on to another, wrongly believing that that other should be the source of my happiness and make me feel good, right? So there's no similarity at all between love and attachment in that sense, right? They're actually very different mental factors, right? Love is realistic also. Love sees, others want happiness. That's true. It would be good if they could have that. May they have that, right? So it's realistic and it's altruistic and it wishes for the welfare of others and it causes happiness. Attachment is unlike that, right? It's a distortion, first of all. The other doesn't exist to make me happy. They exist as a separate being in their own right, right? And also attachment actually causes me, and if I'm relational with the other, it eventually causes the other person suffering, right? And it also causes me suffering by its very nature. So anyway, you get the point. The love and attachment are not at all similar if you understand them as mental factors. And then, still a few minutes. Then it says attachment, this is just categories now. It says attachment is of three types: attachment to the desire realm, attachment to the form realm, and attachment to the formless realm. And then it's going to say the same thing, but in a different categorization. In the treasury of knowledge, it divides into two: attachment to the desire realm and attachment for cyclic existence, which in this case includes the form and formless realms, it says below. The treasury of knowledge condenses attachment to the two upper realms, the form and formless realms, into one, and takes that as attachment to cyclic existence. So now we'll just finish this section. So it says attachment to the desire realm is the aspiration for and attachment to the five qualities of desire realm: form, sound, smell, taste, touch, within observation of them. Sound, smell, taste, and touch. The five. Right. So, and that's, by the way, so the desire realm includes our human realm. Right. So the normal human realm is all part of the desire realm. So, and when you're attached, right? So, I mean, and so you get that. That's the one that's what we're familiar with, isn't it? Attachment to, and it could be, right, attachment to taste is attachment to certain foods, right? And actually, when we're attached to another person, it's usually a combination, isn't it? We're attached to, it could be their form, their sound, right? Their whatever, maybe different combinations of but it's desire, it's attachment to objects of the senses is the point, the things that we can experience with our five senses. And then it says here, attachment to the upper realms is condensed into one, known as attachment for cyclic existence, because the two upper realms referred to as cyclic existence. And this is so the point here is to overcome the mistake of taking meditative absorptions of the form and formless realms as the path to liberation. So what this is saying is just simply that, if you cultivate calm abiding and achieve it, then you can achieve the form realms and the formless realms, which are realms of meditative experience, right? And what this is saying is it's calling those attachment to samsara for a reason. So that we remember, if we cultivate calm abiding, that those are suffering, that those are in the nature of suffering. Those are not liberation from suffering. Because that's a mistake that people make in practice, is that, in the formless realms, for example, right, are the realms of like infinite space and infinite consciousness and nothingness and so on. So sometimes people mistake those for liberation. And what this is saying is those are not liberation. And that's still a form of attachment. So it's kind of funny in a way. What they're saying is, for a yogi, a practitioner who meditates on nothingness, then they have an experience of a concept of nothingness that their mind gets completely absorbed in, and it's a formless realm of nothingness. But they're attached to nothingness. And that's, as Bob Thurman points out, which I always like, he always says, that concept of nothingness is something. It's their concept of nothing. And then they become attached to their concept of nothing, which is actually something, and that's part of samsara, right? So what are they attached to? An internal object, not their concept of nothingness, and that's just another form of attachment. So it's another form of samsaric compounding that comes out of samsaric suffering. So that's not liberation. And don't mistake that for liberation, is what this text is saying. those are all, and that they're all forms of attachment, right? And for the most part, we as ordinary people are attached to the phenomena of the desire realm, right? Which are our own thoughts and sensory objects. Wilhelmina has comment to it. Oh, you're muted. Oh,
No.
there
Yeah,
you go.
now you can hear me.
Yep.
In that context, where does a Pure Land fit in?
So the idea is that like a Pure Land, if it's usually what they would say is that it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like sort of pausing because like I would ask the question would be, you know, attachment, right? Make a point here. Attachment oh, I see. You're asking a different question. What I was thinking is, first of all, it says is a mental fact that perceives a contaminated thing. So one point is a Pure Land a contaminated thing or not? Is one question I would. That's a question I'm raising. But you're raising it. I think what you're getting at is a Pure Land. What realm is it in, right?
Yeah.
And actually, that what they say is that there are. I think there are Pure Lands in the desire realm, and also I think in the form realm. I think there are form realm Pure Lands. Pretty sure, but so a Pure Land, right, is a you could call it like a place or a realm of experience that's created by a fully enlightened Buddha to help beings progress on the path. Actually, in some people, it's interesting, some people call this planet Shakyamuni's Buddha's Pure Land, in the sense that it's the place people go to practice Dharma of Shakyamuni Buddha. But in general, I guess what I'll say, I think your question is this. So in general, Pure Lands are like, actually they give the example of like what's it called? Ganden, like Tushita, Pure Land, which is in the God realm, but is like a subdivision. You know, it's like it's like a Dharma center. They sometimes say that. It's like a Dharma center in the God realm. You know, so like, and where Maitreya is now, Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha was there before, and now Maitreya is the teacher there. So what they say is actually like, that's an example, that Tushita Pure Land, they say, is like it's actually in a God realm, but it's like one, you know, it's like, if you think of like a Dharma center that's part of a town, it's like the Dharma center or the monastery or the whatever, you know, it's not a monastery literally, but so it's like the Pure Lands are in a way, like if you think of them as they're within the realms, you could say they're within the realms of experience within samsara, but then they're manifested by a Buddha in order to educate beings. So in that sense, actually in that sense, I guess you could say a Pure Land can appear in various, you know, wherever there are sentient beings, the Buddha can manifest. Actually, that's true, isn't it? Like they say, for example, yeah, actually, like in a way, if you're with the Dalai Lama, I would argue if you're with the Dalai Lama somewhere, that maybe that's a Pure Land. You know, but it's on this, but it's a within the, you know, but you can't say that I wouldn't be able to argue that this whole planet's a Pure Land. That would be kind of ridiculous, wouldn't it? But if a Pure Land, yeah, so I guess that's what I would say. The Pure Land is a context where beings can practice Dharma, but it's within. But yeah, you would say it's within the 6 realms. So it's within the realms, though, the 6 realms.
Okay, and then the question is, when you're finishing that Pure Land, because there comes an end to it, can you then still come back to the earth?
Oh, sure, yeah. There's a story. Yeah, there's actually the Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gyaltsen. He said, I thought this was an interesting story. I always found this touching. Because Vajrayana is here, where you can achieve enlightenment so quickly, Panchen Lama Losing Choki Gyaltsen said that there are beings in Sukhavati, in Amitabha's Pure Land, which is a very blissful realm, right? Sukhavati means the blissful realm of Sukhavati, of Amitabha, where there's like no, you know, beings, they have beautiful descriptions, right? The ponds and lotuses, and beings are born out of a lotus, and they, you know, kind of is a beautiful place that's like a gorgeous realm where the birds and the trees speak the Dharma and everything. And they say, Panchen Lama said, there are certain beings in Sukhavati Pure Land who are praying, may I be reborn on this earth.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, because I think, where do you go from there? Because, I like the idea that you can get somewhere where you get some peace and quiet to get it done. And then when you're ready, then you can come back. And that's what I hope. But I didn't know anything about Pure Lands.
Yeah, so he says like there are beings in Sukhavati where they're thinking, I want to achieve enlightenment more quickly. From Sukhavati, you'll achieve enlightenment, they say. But they think, oh, it's too slow. I want to go faster. Let me go to the earth where I can practice the Vajrayana. Because in Sukhavati, there's no, you can't practice highest yoga tantra because there's no gender, actually. There's no gender there, so there is no such thing as certain tantric practices. And then they think, oh, may I come to the earth where you can practice Chakra Samvara or Vajrayogini or Guhya Samaja or Yamantaka. So there are stories like that. And so, yeah, there are beings who go back and forth. And then he says, actually, it's harder. He said it's hard to take rebirth in Sukhavati, but it's harder to take rebirth on this earth and study the pure teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation of the Vajrayana, is what he was saying. Particularly, he said that's harder actually to find than Sukhavati. So there are beings who go back and forth between different Pure Land and then a planet like this, and they can go to different places, and then also they can emanate from there. They say also, at a certain level, because they in the Pure Land, Sukhavati Pure Land, they say it takes much longer because it's not Vajrayana, but you can achieve enlightenment, and then you can achieve a certain level, and then you can send emanations to other planets to help others. But it's much slower than on Vajrayana on this planet. But this planet's more dangerous. I had one friend who said to his teacher, oh, should I try to come back here? And then that teacher said, oh, for you, that would be too dangerous. You might not find the Dharma, so try to go to Sukhavati. So it's very individual, I think, which is best for any given person.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of your archetype, isn't it? Where you go. Because the deities are sort of archetypes, right?
Yeah, and so part of it, I guess, is one's own karmic. Some people are connected to Medicine Buddha, and some connected to Amitabha, and some people to Vajrayogini, and some people to Yamantaka. I mean, so there's different practices so it depends on one's karmic connections, I think, like which realm or which deity or which Buddha one has that connection to.
Yeah. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just do the last paragraph of this section on attachment, because that will conclude that section. So it says the function of attachment is specified as producing suffering for the purpose of making us understand that the root of all suffering within the three realms of cyclic existence is rebirth, which connects us to cyclic existence. The principal cause for rebirth within cyclic existence is attachment craving itself. So what's this? I just want to point, this is an important point, is I want to just emphasize a couple things. One is attachment by its very nature, as we've already said, right, is unpeaceful, is discontentment, is disturbance. So its very nature, if you check, and if you meditate on your own experience of attachment, that's actually a suggestion I would make, is think of something you're attached to, and then just meditate and go through step by step, instant by instant. What's my experience like when I first perceived the object, right? Because you think, oh, great, but then actually, if you check your own experience, when you perceive the object, you don't have it, but you're wanting it. That's a kind of suffering, right? And then you can go from there, step by step. What's your process of trying to obtain the object? And then what's your project experience like when you get the object? Then what's your experience like after you've had the object? And if you check your own experience, you'll find, according to what Buddhism is asserting, you can check for yourself, but what Buddhism is asserting is if you actually check your own experience moment by moment, you'll find that the experience of attachment itself is in the nature of suffering. This is making a different point than that, though. What this is saying is it's through attachment that we take rebirth, right? And so that point earlier of the 5 grasping aggregates I mentioned, the aggregates come from grasping, are governed by grasping, and grasping arises from them. So this is getting at when you're dying, actually, right? Desire, craving, and attachment cause you to continue in samsara. And in the 12 links of dependent arising, right, there's contact gives rise to feeling, which gives rise to craving, which gives rise to grasping, which is an increase of craving, a kind of stronger attachment. And that is what causes us to take rebirth. So what this is saying actually is not only is attachment a cause of suffering moment by moment, when we're in a state of attachment, we suffer. This is saying also that because we're always craving, always desiring something, always desiring, desire is all the time there. What this is partly getting at is when you're dying, when the time comes when each of us is going to die, we give rise to attachment, right? It's not surprising, is it? Right? We're attached to this life, or we're attached to our aggregates, or we're attached to being me. We're attached to our stuff. We're attached to something. And what they're saying is that as you're dying, your attachment is there, right? And that attachment activates your karma, and which is becoming. That's where, craving gives rise to grasping, which is an increased, a very intense, when you're dying, you give rise to a very intense kind of attachment to yourself, actually, right? And that activates your karma. And then due to the force of that attachment, you're thrown into your next life, right? And your next set of aggregates. And so that's what's being gotten at here, is that your aggregates, meaning your samsaric body and mind, come from attachment at your previous time of death, actually. And when you die in this life, your attachment is what will throw you, what will activate your karma and throw you into your next life, right? It'll activate your karma and cause you to take another samsaric rebirth. So that's the function of attachment also. And so what it's saying here, the purpose of this is to make us understand that the root of all suffering within the three realms of psychic existence is rebirth, which connects us to samsara, to psychic existence. And the principal cause for rebirth within samsara is attachment, craving itself. It's getting at the 12 links of dependent arising, and how in our past life, when we were dying, we were grasped. And because we grasped, it activated karma and threw us into this life. In this life, when we die, we'll grasp, if we don't realize emptiness directly before then, and so on. And then that will throw us into samsara again. And so this attachment, when they say attachment is the cause of suffering, they're getting at that, actually. That on the one hand, each moment, our attachment causes us to suffer. But particularly, attachment at the moment of death compounds our samsaric existence and throws us into the next life. And once you realize emptiness directly, that will change. Then bodhisattvas take rebirth through the power of compassion. But until then, we take rebirth through the power, we take rebirth through the power of our mental afflictions, actually, and karma, and particularly attachment, craving, and grasping. And John, you have your hand up. Good.
Yeah, the grasping as death is approaching, I don't really read anything here that says what you're grasping, or is it you're literally just trying to grasp and be attached to life itself?
They say, actually, in some teachings it varies from person to person. Like that, what they say is that if you haven't realized emptiness directly, you inevitably grasp. But from my reading, at least, of the teachings, at the minimum, one grasps at sort of being and wanting to continue being, wanting to. But then there are particular kinds of grasping. There are stories, like in Buddhist stories of, like, somebody was, a person grasped at their house and took rebirth as a termite, or so. The person, was grasping at there's stories like that in Buddhism where somebody had buried a treasure and then they were grasping at that as they died, and they take rebirth as like a snake or a bug that's inside the treasure, whatever. So there are many, so you can grasp at all kinds of, there are stories of somebody who grasped at their family member and then took rebirth as took rebirth as their own grandchild or something, so there are all different kinds of grasping that can happen, is my point. So at the minimum, there's a kind of grasping at sort of being, or at, the aggregates, you could say. But then also particular individuals grasp at specific things when they die, and you have to be careful. Actually, there's a teaching that says, therefore, be careful. Like, that's why in like the Lojong teachings, it says like, before you die, give your things away, so you don't think they're yours, because if you die grasping at them as yours, that's worse, actually. That creates a particular kind of suffering. So I think it's varied. Like in general, you could say you grasp at the 5 aggregates, but then everybody's different. So we grasp at specific things as we die sometimes. So it could be different. It could be different for different people, I think, specifically.
Well, what if someone is grasping at enlightenment?
Well, that wouldn't be attachment then, right? Because in other words, if you think about it, what it says here is, if you go back, it says attachment is defined as a mental factor that perceives contaminated thing to be attractive by way of its own entity, and thereupon seeks it. So it has to be a contaminated thing. So if you die, actually, that's why if you were to die wishing for enlightenment, that's not a contaminated thing. So you're okay then. It's not. So you're not exaggerating. Or if you die thinking of the Buddha, that's not a contaminated thing. So you could say those are actually not attachment.
So you can't be attached to the Dalai Lama, then we'll say.
It's an interesting question. Like, I guess it would depend how you. I guess it would depend a little bit how you perceive the Dalai Lama, I suppose. Like from the Dalai Lama, my view from his own side is not a contaminated thing. But I guess, yeah. So I guess if you have faith, I'll leave it at that. If you have faith in the Dalai Lama, saying he's an enlightened being, and I have faith in him, then then that's not actually, because faith is not attachment. That's one way of putting it. Okay, so if you're dying with a state of faith.
So the word grasping actually isn't bad. It's the object that you're grasping.
It's the object and it's the exaggeration.
Right. If you're grasping under the image of the Dalai Lama or Bodh or any place or anything, even though it's a physical thing in samsara, that is not the issue. It's really the object that you're dealing with.
It's the object, and it's the viewing it as attractive by way of its own entity when it's not. That's the key. And so it's the quality of there's always a quality of exaggeration there. So in other words, if you're saying the Buddha is wonderful, they would say, well, that's, first of all, it's not a contaminated thing, and secondly, that's not an exaggeration. The Buddha is wonderful. Or love is wonderful, right? Well, love is wonderful. That's not an exaggeration. So the problem is when, that it's a contaminated thing, and you're viewing it as a source of happiness for yourself when it's by way of its own entity when it's not. That's the problem. Yeah.
So grasping for the Buddha at the time of death is actually a good grasping. Yeah. Because you're trying to vision something that is good, not, gee, I wish I had more money, or I wish I, was younger. Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah, or grasping with attachment to relatives, for example. That's a problem. That would be those would be problematic. Whereas, so you're right. Yeah, whereas if a person dies grasping at Tara as a source of their protection, would be considered not attachment. Thank you.
We went over, so we should stop, but we'll do our dedication. I think we have class next week, if I remember right. Check that. Let's make sure I'm right. Yeah, next week is class. It's okay. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezik, Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, said the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Well, thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Lauren, it's good to see you again.
You
Thanks
too.
so much, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.